Hello and welcome to this episode of Shop Talk with Writers, the podcast where we discover the stories behind the books. I'm Elena Lappin, and my guest today is best-selling German-Austrian novelist Daniel Kehlmann to tell us about his fascinating new novel, The Director, based on the life of Austrian director GW Pabst, one of the leading directors of early 20th century cinema, who returned to Nazi Germany from exile in Hollywood. It's a brilliant story about complicity and historical truth, with intriguing implications for our own times. Daniel Kehlmann is the award-winning author of Till, Measuring the World, and other novels. He is one of the most translated German writers today. This novel was translated into English by Ross Benjamin. Born in Munich and raised in Vienna, Daniel Kehlmann now lives in Berlin and New York City. We met in London in one of his publisher's beautifully book-lined offices. Enjoy.
This is Shop Talk with Writers.
I'm Daniel Kehlmann, and I'm reading a short excerpt from my novel, The Director, which just came out in English. And this is a passage that's actually about what it means to be a director, especially in the early days of film, but then also in general. Director was, all in all, a strange profession. One was an artist, but created nothing, instead directing those who created something, arranging the work of others who, viewed in the cold light of day, were more capable than oneself. That was why so much was required before one could even start to work. Writers, artists, composers needed only paper, at most paint. Sculptors needed marble and a few tools, but a director needed 100 people and a studio and machines and a great deal of electricity. All this had to be paid for, so he always also needed someone to entrust him with a lot of money. And that was why one rarely made films. The rest of the time one talked to people and went out to lunch and wrote letters and gave lectures and tried to convince someone. And again one secretly wondered when all the people working on a film together would realize that they all could do it without a director too, if only they agreed. Because the actors could certainly act on their own, the camera operator could easily film them, the architect could build a stage for them, and the editor could select and assemble the best footage afterward. But because everyone simply believed that a director was necessary, the whole thing was not undertaken without a director. Moving pictures had once been a fairground attraction, bouncing balls, boxing kangaroos, dancing couples, cane-swinging men. A dirty screen at the Kutschkermarkt in the 18th district, a man named Zacharias Molander shouting, "Step up! Ladies and gentlemen, come and see for yourselves," while his wife played the accordion, and images they had recorded on their homemade cameras jerked overhead. It had made a deep impression on Pabst. He never forgot the fighting kangaroos, never the men with their twirling canes, and never the name Molander.
Thank you very much. Daniel Kehlmann, welcome to Shop Talk with Writers. We are very pleased to be sitting down with you in the building of your British publisher. Has this book been translated into many languages?
Quite a few
like
by
your
now.
other
Yes.
books have?
Yes, quite a few by now. So it already came out in, most major European languages. I'm just coming from Sweden, where the Swedish translation came out, and a little while ago, Danish came out, French, Bulgarian, actually, Hungarian, which is very important in the context of that novel, Italian, maybe I'm forgetting one or two, and there are a few more forthcoming. So So I'm kind of, my advantage right now is that I have talked about that book quite a bit. So I have more answers ready than I did when the novel came out in Germany 2 years ago.
2 years ago. 2 or 3?
Actually, no, I've a little bit less even, 1.5 years ago, actually.
Yeah. So it's quite recent in German as well.
Yes.
So we could be having this interview in German, but we won't. No worries. I was wondering about your personal geography to begin with, because you are described as a German-Austrian novelist. How does that work out in terms of where you grew up?
Well, I'm really both in terms of general culture, if that's the right word, and growing up, because my mother is German, my father was Austrian. I was born in Munich, but then my parents moved to Vienna when I was 6 and had to start school. So I did spend much more time in my childhood in Austria. But we always had family in Germany, and I also moved to Berlin when I was in my mid-20s. So I'm really both, and also in terms of culture, I was very much shaped and formed by classical German culture, which in a way Measuring the World is about. And this book, the director, in a way, was a homecoming to Austria, actually a quite rainy, dark and muddy Austria, but that's where the Austrian part of the novel takes place.
And where do you live now?
Right now, I am kind of in between, moving back and forth between Berlin and New York, but as you actually, in terms of fact, mostly live where your kid goes to school. I live in New York because that's where my son goes to school.
So Measuring the World was about 2 German thinkers who, on the basis of their knowledge at the time, decide to measure the world. But one of them stays home, Gauss, and the other, Humboldt, although he's also full of ideas and theories, but he goes out there and experiences every detail of the world in order to measure it. Which one of those approaches would you say is closer to what a novelist does?
Yes, definitely Gauss. The novelist is the person who stays at home and thinks and tries to travel in their mind. And many novelists have been in denial about that and have tried to make a point that they're really big-time adventurous and are courageous. And some are, of course, all these things. But then they had to go home and sit down. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been novelists. So I really think ultimately the novelist is definitely the person who stays at home. Or as Martin Amis put it in an essay many years ago, nothing ever happens to a novelist. And of course, some things happen to novelists, but not in their function as novelists. In their function as novelists, nothing happens to them. They stay home.
Well, staying home doesn't mean that nothing happens to them.
Of course. And he actually made that distinction too, because he published a book of his reporting, and his point was, as opposed to the novelist, nothing ever happens to a novelist. The reporter is the person to whom stuff happens. So but yes, the novelist is a person to whom things happens at home. Yeah, that's actually,
or anywhere where they are,
where they're writing. So in their writing room.
So, for example, we are here sitting, the 2 of us, and the 3 of us, actually, because Max is recording this. And after this conversation, I'm sure you could go home and I could go home and we could write a completely different reportage, or story about what just happened.
Yes.
So it's having been here in this situation, but also combined with who we are and what our life has brought to us up to this point of writing this particular account. So I'm very interested in how you choose your themes for your novels. So you seem to choose real people, historically.
Not
real.
always, but
Not always.
But sometimes, yeah.
Of course, yeah. But a few times you've done that.
Yeah.
Or slightly mythological figures, but known, like Till Eulenspiegel. But you then take them and you kind of resurrect them or reinvent them in your own way. What attracts you in your characters, in your protagonists?
I mean, that method, if you want to call it a method, is something that I'm, far from being the first or even the 20th or probably the 100th person who does that, but I've been doing it quite a bit. And it is something that we're more used to in theater and in films in a way. So nobody finds it strange or is confused about Julius Caesar or Cicero on stage, because it's clear that's an actor, that's not Julius Caesar. But it's also clear it's not a character that has absolutely nothing to do with Julius Caesar. So there is a reason why you're calling that person Julius Caesar. And it gets more and more complex or interesting, that relationship between truth and fiction, the closer you get to the present. And a very interesting, but ultimately also not puzzling example is this wonderful film The Apprentice that was just in cinemas, which is about how Donald Trump became Donald Trump with some very good actors. And it's clear that this is fiction, but it's also clear that it has something to do with the real Donald Trump. It's not it's a film that wants to give us a probable and likely version of what could have happened and what made him the terrible person he is now, and a version that is, it probably didn't happen quite like that, but that fictional version makes things visible that in some way happened, but not that visibly. And I would say when I use real characters, I do something that, for methodical reasons, and with good methodical reasons, journalists and historians would sometimes like to do, but are not, again, for good reasons, not allowed to do, which is forming a clear picture in their mind of what probably happened, and then write something that describes that version of what probably happened, what could most likely have happened. And that is mostly what I'm doing when I work with historical characters. I create a version that I think has to be somehow close to at least what I think is probable or likely, or at least possible. It cannot be something where I think like this could have never happened. That wouldn't make sense. But on the basis of that, you can, you create a story that feels it makes sense in an artistic way. And we can talk about why, especially with the director, I did not use fictional names. I used all these real names, because in the beginning I thought about just doing that, but then I changed my mind for reasons we can talk about if you want to, or if maybe this is going into too much detail.
I would love to talk about that in a moment, but first, if you could explain, because I'm very interested in how you chose this particular somewhat or quite forgotten German director, real director, GW Pabst. GW Pabst made some great movies. He made some shitty movies. Yes. He made some mediocre movies. He was no Fritz Lang, but you chose him for a certain reason. I have a feeling you chose him because you were intrigued by the fact that he went back to Germany, having been in America.
That was the only reason.
That was the big question mark. How would that have worked out? But were you also looking for a character or a protagonist in order to capture something important to you about that period and about that political
Yes, absolutely.
time?
If you're if you're a German writer, you always have it in the back of your mind to write something about the Nazis and the Third Reich. Not because you have to. There's no moral obligation to write about anything. You can perfectly well be a writer and write beautiful poems about the grass and flowers and trees. There's nothing morally wrong about that, in my opinion. But of course, it's a big wealth of obviously very interesting and intriguing material that's available for you as a German language writer, available for you to you in an immediate way, because it's your language, it's your culture. You have those connections in a way that I would obviously not have if I wanted to write about the dictatorship in North Korea, which could be material for great books, but I'm not able to write them, obviously. So you always think about writing about that, and also I had some family history there, because my father was born in 1927 what the Nazis, the Nuremberg laws would have called half-Jewish family, the son of half-Jewish parents. And he had very vivid memories of going to school under the Nazis, of then being expelled from school. He then ended up being in a concentration camp, a labor camp for 3 months. But that was actually not that important for this book. For this book, it was more important what he told me about everyday life and what it felt like to go to school under the Nazis and all these things. So another reason why I felt like I had a direct connection. But I didn't have a great story. Just my father's story of going to school. I didn't have enough. There was not enough for a novel, and it also wouldn't have been the kind of really unusual angle that I felt was needed to write about a topic about which so much has been written. And so I was thinking about a completely different novel in the beginning, which would have been set in the 1920s in the silent movie industry. And that was not yet by far my novel about the Nazis. And then I happened to find that detail from GW Pabst's biography, which is that he was in Hollywood and then went back to Nazi Germany and made films for Goebbels. And I thought, like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone who's not a Nazi, there was no doubt about him not being a Nazi, how would anyone have done that? And then I had this feeling, and you were asking about how I chose my topics or my stories or characters. It's sometimes this strange magnetic feeling that you feel like there is a story in this. There is something that I want to spend years, because it's years, writing about. And there was this idea of someone who is safe, who is in Hollywood, who has made it to America and then turns back. And I, as a storyteller, could step by step return to that dark world with him. So it was literally my access, like I could move there with him. And yeah, I felt like that's what I wanted to do, to go there as a storyteller and to look not at the big crimes and the big murderers, but what everyday life must have been like, and everyday compromise of being in book clubs or having a script meeting or going through life day by day.
Did you ever feel that by doing that, by focusing on the everyday under those conditions, that you were maybe humanizing the Nazi regime too much? Or were there any moments like that?
I actually didn't. I didn't, because it's about this special aspect. I felt that so important, that the totalitarian state makes you complicit constantly in so many small ways. And it's kind of the opposite of humanizing. It's about how the totalitarian state is dehumanizing every small part of our daily life. So I have a chapter in the book about a book club with some women from society together reading a book which is not even a political book. It's by some Nazi writer, but it's an apolitical book. And even that discussion, they have to all the time negotiate in their mind what writers they can reference, because that changes. There's no guidebook. Who's still allowed to be even mentioned? Who's not allowed to be mentioned? Someone mentions the cups on the table, but there was a no-go because they belong to the neighbors who are not there anymore. They don't say why. So I felt like, and that was a story that, again, others have written about that too. I'm not claiming to be the first, obviously, but it's about the constantly dehumanizing machine that the totalitarian state is. So yeah, I didn't feel I was humanizing it.
So in your case, you're writing about a film director during the Nazi era, but the same sort of compromising takes place in any totalitarian regime.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, and I know the painful compromises that artists had to make in order to do something that was important to them personally. How do I do that without being a collaborator with the regime? And many have, and many have not.
Yes.
So let's talk about this director, GW, that's Georg Wilhelm.
Georg Wilhelm, yes.
Pabst. You open the book with him in Hollywood, where he's having a classic Hollywood chat where they're trying to convince him to make a bad movie, and they pretend that they love his art, but in fact they know nothing about it. They keep confusing him with other directors. And then you bring him back through this story to Germany because his mother is ill. How much did you have to know about Pabst as a real person before you could dive into this narrative? Did you have to know, because there isn't that much about him
There
out
isn't
there.
that much, yeah.
How much did you have to know about how he talked, for example? What accent did he have? We know what he looked like, but we don't really know how he presented himself with people. How did you go about that?
We actually don't know how he talked.
There's no interview?
There is no interview. There is in one documentary they have about 10 seconds of him talking, and they don't have more, and I think they don't have more because there isn't more. I couldn't find more than that. And the only thing you can say about these 10 seconds is that it's surprising for people from today how he does not sound Viennese. But that's normal. Like, you have the same thing with Schnitzler or Hoffmannsthal. People from the generation born at the end of the 19th century or early 20th century into bourgeois Vienna, they have not what we think of as a Viennese accent. So I was not surprised about that, but it's interesting every single time socially.
So is it like Hochdeutsch?
It's very, very Hochdeutsch, yes.
Really?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But it's the same when you listen to Schnitzler. So, I mean, we can do a whole podcast about this because I'm so fascinated by it.
That's very interesting.
What we think of as the normal, regular Viennese accent is something that was really pushed a lot after the Second World War because the whole Austrian culture was based on showing every second of every day we are not German. We have nothing to do with Germany. When I went to school, we got something that's called Österreichisches Wörterbuch, Austrian diary, and it was German diary, but it wasn't even called German diary. So dialect, Viennese accent, sounding like the working class Viennese actually. So the Viennese dialect was really used to make very clear that people are not Germans, and so it was spoken much more heavily. But the generation, that generation of bourgeois Viennese people that someone like Pabst belonged to, they had no Viennese dialect. So to a degree that's surprising to us later born Austrians. But yeah, that's just a little detail. You asked about how much I needed to know about him. There is not a lot to know, but I did try to find out as much as I could. Actually, only 2 books have been written about him. One is a big catalog for a retrospective at Berlinale, and the other one is a monography in English by an American movie historian. And other than that, it's just bits in some other people's autobiographies who mention him. Yes,
for example, did you pick up, where did you, maybe you didn't pick it up anywhere, maybe this is how you imagined it, but did anyone mention his way of speaking to actors when he directed them? Because you made him sound very gentle.
Yeah, not really. What people mentioned is that he was very good with actors and that actors felt safe working with him, which no one, for example, ever said about Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang was like a terrorist on set. People feared him to an unbelievable extent. And Pabst was not like that. So I imagined that he was very gentle talking to actors. And he was actually better than Fritz Lang in getting actors to do subtle nuances. So that's one of the things that I imagined from watching his films.
So he may be a forgotten director, but he has 2 amazing deeds to his name. And that is the discovery of 2 great actresses of that era, maybe even 3, but Greta Garbo.
Yes.
And Louise Brooks.
Yes.
I don't care really much about Greta Garbo. She's amazing, but I don't, I can take her or leave her. But
yes.
I'm obsessed with Louise Brooks.
Yes.
I have been for years.
Yes.
I've read everything about her, by her. I've looked at photographs. I have a book that is literally an account of how Pandora's Box was filmed.
Yes.
So that's the kind of stuff I would have looked at. Did you use that?
Oh, yes, I used that. It's very hard to not be obsessed by Louise Brooks, not just because she was so unbelievably charismatic and beautiful, but also because she was so brilliant. I don't have to tell you, her autobiography is just an amazing book.
And so ahead of her time.
And so are her letters. And one of the most amazing experiences of actually going to the archives and reading the letters of Pabst and his family, which there is I would have to say, an extensive collection of, which is the letters that the family actually handed over to the Deutsche Kinemathek, because there are some gaps there, but something that is there is the letters that Louise Brooks later wrote to Pabst himself at first, and then to his son, Michael, his younger son, who was born in 1944, so who's in no way in my book because it was not around during those years. And when you get to Louise Brooks' letters, it's like a fireworks of brilliance and wit going off. So you sit in the archives, you're slightly bored, you go through letter after letter, and then you turn the page, you get through a letter of Louise Brooks, and it's unbelievable. Like she was such a good writer. She was also a deeply troubled person in many ways, so which is also why her career after her initial stardom never took off again. But I really feel like someone should write a novel about her, but that should be someone else. That should actually probably be a female novelist, to be honest.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if a female novelist necessarily, but a novel should be written about her for sure.
Yes, and a film should be made about her.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's waiting to happen, I feel. So you have an interesting sort of dilemma maybe, or dichotomy, using a real but not very well-known character as your protagonist, but then mentioning many, many, many real people in his stories. So there were many actors, other filmmakers, with real names, and one can read your book and look them up.
Yes.
What does Wikipedia say about him and her, and so on, with dates and everything. And so there, would you say you might be kind of moving into slightly trickier territory?
But I had to do it that way. That's the point.
I'm not accusing you.
No. I'm just because I was thinking about
Yeah.
that, and I was actually trying in the beginning to completely fictionalize all that. And that's why I'm saying I had to do it that way, because I figured out I had to do it that way. Because in the beginning, I started writing it with a director that was based on Pabst and this weird turn and coming back to Germany, but I thought I'd give him a fictional name. And then I realized then I have to give him fictional films too, because it doesn't make sense if he has a fictional name and then he makes Pabst films. But that films, to make also sense in the context in which he's making them, they have to be a little bit like the films that Pabst made. So I had to invent films that are a little bit like those films, with fictional titles and maybe slightly different plot. But then actors have to be in them. Then I would have to invent those actors. So it couldn't have been Louis Brooks. It would have been some other amazingly brilliant and beautiful American sexy actress. And then I realized everybody would just think, oh, he's talking about Louis Brooks. And people would start looking them up, and it would the whole thing would be like a game of charade. Like, who's he talking about now? Who's this? Who's that? And it all felt so lifeless and uninteresting to do this parallel universe that's just like 5 centimeters removed from our universe, with everybody having some kind of fictional parallel version. And then I remember that very well. I felt like I have to give up this book. It doesn't work. It was just
because of that problem.
I only figured out it was that problem, but it all felt lifeless. And then I remember that I just sat down one afternoon, and I started with what's now the first Pabst chapter. There's a chapter that I had already about his assistant as an old man, who is fictional, so no problem there. But that I started just this chapter with Pabst standing at the swimming pool, sweating, and it was Pabst, not someone else. And it felt like an infusion of narrative energy. It felt like suddenly I felt so freed up by that. And I started using all these real names, and it felt so much better to not have to deal with all these roman à clef removal strategies. And so that's why I'm saying I had to do it. It wouldn't have worked otherwise.
Well, this podcast is called Shop Talk with Writers, so we really want to understand what led to your decisions to do things in a certain way. And this is a brilliant way of explaining that moment. So I really appreciate that you opened that up.
I was thinking this is called Shop Talk, so I'm going to tell you.
That's what it's about. I wanted to say that although you said you had to look at, you had to invent films, but then you decided to actually write about real films that were made. And so obviously you studied them, and you understood how they were made, and you thought about it, and you reimagined the staging of them and every detail, even camera movements and the thinking behind them. But there is a film in your book which Pabst made, but apparently it has been completely lost.
Yes, the Fall Molander, the Molander case.
The Molander case, did you actually... He filmed that in Prague just before the Prague Uprising, end of the war. So that film was lost. Although, when you look it up in Wikipedia, it says that some of it is in the Prague Film Archive.
Yeah, that's not correct.
I was wondering about that.
As far as I'm... If it were, that wouldn't be a big problem, because I did read, I did not see the film, obviously. I did read the book it's based on and his production notes. He had only for that film, weirdly, he had a little notebook that he filled while he was shooting it. So the main thing to know about this film is if it would turn up, everybody would be very disappointed, especially everyone who read my book, because it was utterly uninteresting. He was utterly uninterested. He just did it because he had to shoot something.
Mechanically.
And he actually was quite interested in money. That's an aspect it's not in my book because I found it uninteresting and for what I wanted to write about. And it was all a total mess because it was, last months of the war and no supplies. Everybody worried about being called to the front. Everybody actually just being desperate, and he couldn't have cared less about that film.
Daniel, you imagined this film, this non-existent film.
Yes, but I imagine it as a masterpiece, as a lost masterpiece.
Yes,
so that's my creative freedom.
And did you imagine it on the basis of those notes, or just
not
your
at all?
own? No.
Not at all. So that's what I do feel like I'm free to do as a novelist.
Yeah.
This film in my novel is his return to old form and him being with the resources the Nazis give him, which is, of course, in order to, it's the peak of his moral downfall in a way, but that moral downfall is much more interesting and more complete if he actually uses the resources the Nazis give him to create a masterpiece. Because if he uses it to create some idiotic, uninteresting film, there's much less of a story there, and I am a storyteller, and but to to follow up on that question about the film, it says on Wikipedia that it's in the archives in Prague. I was not able to locate it, and I thought, yeah, fine, I don't actually need it, but somebody from the film desk of Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung was really trying to locate it after my book came out, and had to then say no. The Prague archives told him they do not have it. And then also I had a major film scholar coming to one of my readings and telling me he's been trying to locate this film for a long time and it's just not there. So probably the material just burned or was destroyed when the Red Army was moving into Prague. But again, in reality, nothing much was lost there. And the fact that that real Pabst never tried to locate that film, never talked about that film, and was apparently utterly not interested, proves that there was nothing there. And
yet in your novel, you describe it as really essential to him at that point in his life and being broken by the fact that the film has completely disappeared.
Yes.
So that really shows how free you are in your imagining of this character.
Yes.
I wanted to, hopefully I'll find this spot where there's a moment when he's discussing this particular film with one of the actors or a key actor on the way there to the filming. So he's telling this actor, the actor says, who's playing the forger in the film? And Pabst says, you. And the actor says, oh. And says, you're playing both roles. Why am I only hearing about this now? Because I only thought of it yesterday. And now comes the sentence, which really struck me as fascinating. Two old men, almost indistinguishable. Who cares who's on which side?
Yeah.
I see it differently, Pabst, says the other man. It makes all the difference in the world which side one stands on. But if you're paying for two roles, why not? I'll play them both.
Yeah.
Very funny. But this is the key, I think, to the entire idea of this novel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because Pabst at some point decides, well, I have no choice, so I'll make movies in Nazi Germany for Goebbels and the regime.
Try to make them good, as I have to make them.
Yes.
Yeah.
But others think and say, including his wife, that it does make a difference.
Yes.
And they don't feel comfortable with that, and they wouldn't be encouraging him to do that or wouldn't be involved in that themselves.
Absolutely, yes. And what I do not want to do with that book is to repeat that old stale line about people like to say when they want to just excuse everything, who knows what I would have done. Mm-hmm. By which they usually mean I do know what I would have done, which is I would have compromised. And
you would have, personally.
No, people who say that.
But would you?
Well, I think the right answer because of course none of us knows before we are tested how we will, whether we will prevail or not. I think of course, in factual terms, to say I don't know what I would have done is not wrong, because no one knows. But it's a little bit like saying all life matters when someone says Black lives matter. It's factually true that all lives matter, but people usually mean something that's morally problematic. And so I think the right thing is to say, I really, really hope I would have done the right thing, and not to let go of that moral necessity to at least attempt to do the right thing. And there are people in my book who do not compromise,
yeah.
And actually, the Third Reich had many of those people, especially in the movie business, because Goebbels, and it's one of the weird historical facts about that dictatorship, for example, also as opposed to the Soviet Union under Stalin, is that the Nazis, well, in that case, mainly Goebbels, wanted to make good apolitical films. So a very famous fact is that Erich Kästner was allowed to write scripts just under pseudonym, a completely forbidden writer whose books were publicly burned, but Goebbels allowed him to stay around and write scripts because he just did it well. And some people who were really opposed to the Nazis kind of did work in the movies. But of course, it's always problematic. Something that I was only made aware of towards the end of my book is that as any industry in the Third Reich, the film industry heavily relied on forced labor, for example. Mm. So even the most innocuous apolitical films were actually made by people who didn't have a choice and were basically slave laborers. So it's another example for maybe you could somehow staying in the countryside and hiding out in a farmhouse, but actually there was no real way for most people to stay innocent in Nazi Germany in any way.
Leni Riefenstahl figures in your book several times, and you describe her as completely abhorrent.
Yes.
There is a documentary out about her now. Have you seen it? I was wondering what you think of it.
I have seen it. It's very good. It's also good because it brings a lot of visual material to convince people who have not looked into Leni's biography that much. For someone who has researched Leni and has read some books about her, that documentary is not that surprising. So I was not surprised because I knew what monster she was. But for many people, actually, this documentary is the first time they learn about that. And that's very, very good. And I'm very grateful it exists.
I love that you have a bit there where you show what a terrible actress she was.
She was so bad. It's and anyone can see her film Tiefland, and she was actually kind of an okay actress before the war, but she turned into, when she made the film that was supposed to be her big film, Tiefland. She worked on that film many years, and that film is unwatchably bad, and she's also playing the main part. And anyone and I still meet people who are a little bit angry about how I treat Leni in my novel. Yeah, she still has a fan base. And but I urge anyone to watch that film to get rid of the idea that she was some kind of uncanny genius of modern movie.
Daniel, for me, any novelist, no matter what form of storytelling they choose, is interesting to the extent that I find them in their books. What is their voice? Who are they? Why are they choosing to tell this particular story and in this specific way? So I am not sure that I know how to find you in your books, because you are telling these incredibly well-told narratives that are very entertaining, very interesting, fascinating, great to read. And I keep asking myself, where's Daniel Kehlmann in this story? Who is he? Why this? So in this book, I have a question. You invented a son for Pabst.
Not quite.
Well, I know he had a son.
He had a son who was the same age and who went through some very similar stages in his life. But go on. So
my question about that son is, he starts out as a kid, because they've just emigrated to America. He starts out as a kid who goes to school in Hollywood, in LA. He speaks American English. He has that experience. And then they leave and they go to France, and then they go to Switzerland. So he moves from country to country, from school to school. He ends up in Austria, where he begins to adjust to a culture where he has to assert himself in order not to be seen as a victim or a loser. He gains the upper hand by being very manipulative, and he ends up being in the Hitlerjugend and in the army, and he's a Nazi believer. That bit of moving from country to country, school to school, is that something you've experienced?
No, not really. I mean, I moved once.
You moved once.
I moved only
I'm
once.
Completely off.
From kindergarten to school when my parents moved from Munich to Vienna. So that's not enough. It's more, I used some of the school stories of my father, as I mentioned, but
he's a very interesting character, this son.
I think he's very close to my heart in a way, because he's also a very, very gifted child who then gets broken, but not in the way that you have read in many of the classical novels about gifted young people broken by school, like Törles by Musil or Hermann Hesse's Unterm Rad and some others. He gets broken by becoming the perpetrator. So broken and crushed in the way that the dictatorship turns him into an accessory, and he doesn't have a choice. I mean, he's too young to resist that. And that was also why I changed the name, to make clear I do not know much about Peter Pabst. So this is a fictional character. I did see letters from Salem by Peter Pabst where he talks in a rather enthusiastic way about the system around him, and how could he not, poor young man. But again, I don't know what happened with Peter Pabst or in his soul, so I did want to make clear that that's an invention. But it's the most tragic story in the book. Is what happens to Jakob, because he's becoming he's not a victim. He becomes not a criminal, but definitely the opposite of a victim.
Yeah, definitely. But in the beginning, when you show him as a young boy who has the talent to draw, to paint,
very well,
and you describe his thinking as he does that. What am I actually doing as I'm drawing, as I'm depicting what I see on paper? And you say that what he's thinking is that in order to do what I'm doing on paper, in order to capture what I see, I don't need to know what's inside that thing or that person. I just have to see what I see.
It's even necessary to draw, because drawing is the act of kind of taking the substance out of things. Drawing means you do look at what it appears like, and when you learn how to draw, you have to actually learn to, for a moment, to forget what an object is, to really see it. So really seeing means like forget what you know about it, just see. And then it comes back when he learns how to shoot, when he learns how to kill animals. First animals, later it will, of course, in the war be human beings. He does the same thing, because it's terrible to shoot a little deer, and he thinks he forgets that he makes himself the same way forget that it's a human being, and he kills that deer. So, but it is the same act he used when he learned how to draw and when he taught himself how to draw.
I found that actually kind of sociopathic, this kind of disconnect from what's around him and what he sees, and then rendering it beautifully because he has the talent to do that, but not attempting to understand what he's looking at.
It becomes sociopathic when you use it to kill animals. But
that was the kernel of that.
Yeah, totally. But a very innocent version of that is what everybody has to do who learns how to draw. That's what I liked about this. It is, yeah, it is. Because that's what I was always taught, because I'm terrible at drawing things. And people always taught me, just look, forget what it is, just look. And I'm really not gifted for drawing. So I'm not able to do that. But I also looked into manuals of drawing, and that's what they say. Just look and forget what it is. Just look at the appearance. Look at light and shadow. But forget that it's light and shadow. It's just colors. It's nothing else. It's just colors. I find that very fascinating because I'm not able to do it ever.
So how would you relate that to what a director does?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Never thought about that. Well, a director is also creating a tiny bit of reality. I mean, the part of reality that's in a film is incredibly small. It's just basically a little cube of reality that's actually in focus, that the camera has to capture. I'm saying cube because usually even the background is not quite in focus. It's just a tiny bit of reality that you have to create. And it's completely artificial. And a director is much more about creating artificial reality than, for example, a writer. Directing is not about capturing the fullness of reality. It's about creating a very, very small slice of pseudo-reality, which then in editing, the long, long process of editing, you put together all these little parts of pseudo-reality to create an illusion of something really lively and moving and life-encompassing. But what a director does is really not similar to what a writer does, I feel. It's kind of profoundly different.
In the passage that you read for us about what a director does, it struck me as not being necessarily entirely true. I don't know if I agree with it. I think the director is an artist who shows us the kind of reality he creates.
Yes, by now,
from all of these elements.
That's why I said
but not at the time.
Not at the time. Or people didn't see it like that. It was then actually the generation of Murnau and Pabst and Fritz Lang and Griffith, DW Griffith in America, who's made the most unbearable racist movie of all times, but that's a different story, who established to a certain extent the idea of a director as an artist. But then in the Hollywood studio system, nobody would have thought of that. And then it was actually some people in France who wrote in Cahiers de Cinema after the war who really established the idea of a director as an artist. And that's how we all think of it. And of course, I mean, I could not have written my books without, for example, the films of David Lynch or Ingmar Bergman. Of course, these are among the world's greatest artists of all time.
But Metropolis is a vision.
Yeah. It's actually, I'm not even such a fan of that film, to be honest.
Irrelevant.
Yeah,
it
irrelevant.
It is a vision that comes straight from his mind. It's like a dream, like a nightmare.
And that is pretty much the film that did most to establish the idea at that time of the director as a supreme artist working on his own vision and creating his own vision. But yeah, it's a little bit comparable to the history of the novel. When people in the 18th century, the novel was really, even though some of the great novels of all times were already written, the novel was regarded as a minor form, an entertainment. The real thing was the verse epic and of course poems, and sometimes in some circumstances plays, but mostly the verse epic. And the verse epic has completely disappeared. no one even wants to read them anymore, the ones that were really big back then. And the novel has become the major, for a while, obviously now, the major established form of literary art. But it was so free to develop because it was not an art form that was under the confines of having to be art with a big A. And that freed it up so much. And I think that happened to film for a while. And it is not impossible that those golden age is over, that now film is kind of, I mean, some very good films are still made, but that it's now unusual for great art to show itself in film. But I don't know, actually. I don't want to make...
You didn't actually answer my question about where is Daniel Kehlmann in this book?
Everywhere.
Okay.
Everywhere. I'm not Pabst, but of course I'm also not Pabst. I'm really identifying with him while I'm writing the book. I'm there with him. And
you understand his situation.
I understand his situation
place.
Completely. And I'm really there with him. But when his wife suffers because of the compromises he makes, I'm fully there with her. I'm there with his son. I'm not there with Leni. I feel like can treat, or the minister, Goebbels, I can treat minor characters.
Well, thank God for that.
Yes, right. But I mean, it's a real question. I feel minor characters I can treat as cartoonish buffoons. But I could not do that to a main character. So if I would actually, and I have no intention of doing that, but if I would actually write a novel about Leni Riefenstahl, I would have to treat her much more humane than I'm doing it now in this book where she's a minor character. I'm everywhere. I'm in the atmosphere. I'm in the jokes. I'm in all the failed attempts of people to communicate with each other. It's my worldview that happens all the time. I'm in the rain in the Austrian countryside and the mud and all the surreal things that happen is how I feel when I go through the world and I'm utterly puzzled. So and I'm not saying I never use stories from my own life. I also do that quite a lot, actually. But I feel like I'm in the whole thing. I'm actually everywhere. And the more I'm able to do that, the better the novel. There's a great line in J.D. Salinger's last published story where Seymour Glass, who's his genius writer character, says to his younger brother, who's a writer, he says, when you write, see to it that all your stars are out. And I think that's the best creative writing advice I've ever heard. And that's something I'm really trying. So I really reject the idea that I'm not in my writing because I'm trying, and I'm not saying I succeed, but I'm trying to have all my stars out, like everything I am, my sense of humor, my sense of my constant slight depression I might have, my neurosis, my nervousness, whatever, for all of that to be in the book as much as possible, even if I invent stories.
Of course. I have to say, I read parts of your book on a train and then sitting in a train station. So there was a lot of noise going on, people, trains, this kind of racket. And I found it perfect as a background for reading your book. Because your book feels very real. It feels like it's completely sort of alive with what happens, travel and movement from one place to another, people getting stuck, people dealing with physical situations. Incredibly entertaining. It's a real page turner, by the way. And I have to say, you came up with a brilliant idea in this novel by inserting P.G. Wodehouse into it. I was very surprised because you don't name him.
I don't name him, yeah.
And I actually had to Google which British writer was a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany and did some broadcast from it. I had known it, I forgot who it was. Of course, P.G. Wodehouse, and I think your translator did a brilliant job rendering that particular chapter.
We really rewrote that chapter for English publication.
It's because it's written in the English of that era and in his style.
It's really
very
written
witty.
In German. It was enough for me to, because it's in German, obviously, to make it sound like an okayish German translation of P.G. Wodehouse, because it's in German.
Yeah.
And Wodehouse is kind of untranslatable, and you cannot quite capture his voice in German. So I did also inserted a little bit of Thomas Mann's long sentences, and it's not quite P.G. Wodehouse. The style, the voice,
style, the
character, yes, but not the voice. And then when my wonderful translator Ross translated that chapter into English, we felt it doesn't really work because it's not quite perfectly. It's not a perfect rendering of P.G. Wodehouse's voice, and it would just feel like I didn't get it right. And I wouldn't have even dared to do P.G. Wodehouse in English, not just because it's not my first language, but because I think he's one of the supreme stylists of actually all time. So Ross and I and a close friend of mine who's an absolutely brilliant editor, Lauren Stein, we really rewrote that chapter because Lauren, he came up with that unbelievably helpful idea to say we should not try to turn this into the P.G. Wodehouse of the Wooster stories or the other stories, the Smith stories, for example. We should really look at the Wodehouse of the interviews because that's closest to his own voice, and that's also most remote from his very, very particular amazing style. And Lauren did an amazing, helpful job editing this chapter down to a P.G. Wodehouse interview description. And then we went through it on the basis of what he had done sentence by sentence. We had an amazing amount of fun. We did that on FaceTime. I was actually in the Alps and Ross was in upstate New York, and Lauren, I think, was in New York City, but I'm not sure. And we spent hours on FaceTime talking it over sentence by sentence, and came up with a chapter in English that's now really different from that chapter in German and all the other translations, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
As a fact, it's wonderful. I make a little remark in the end of the book about that for the very unlikely case that someone wants to compare. But that chapter had to be different in English because it had to be P.G. Wodehouse. Even though I'm not using the name, it had to be his real voice. But it's his real voice from P.G. Wodehouse talking. It's not the voice from the Wooster stories.
That's really interesting. And I love that you did that. I love that you inserted him in there for no other reason than to have that particular chapter with him observing what he does.
Yeah, and also
in his own
what happened to him during the war is like a different, less morally grave story of entanglement.
But it's parallel.
Than Pabst. There are some parallels there. The Nazis captured him. He was a prisoner of war, but they put him in the Adlon and asked him to write, I think, 5 or 6 broadcasts, which are actually very funny to read, like everything he wrote, and which are really not propaganda in any way, but the British actually felt it was, and Churchill wanted to shoot him. And after the war, the only reason he wasn't shot was because Queen Mum was such a fan. And he was considered a traitor and a collaborator, which I think everyone now agrees is unfair. But I felt he's the one international brilliant celebrity who was actually there during those months. Yeah. And I felt, let's just send him to a Pabst film opening as a narrator.
That is totally Daniel Kehlmann, to create the situation, to have fun with it, and to see where it goes.
Yeah, and he's like the voice of brilliance and wit, and in real, truly urban international perspective, being kind of parachuted into this dark, provincial, small world of Third Reich cultural politics or cultural social interactions. And I also felt like it really puts things into perspective for a moment, how utterly mediocre all these people are. Just if P.G. Wodehouse looks at them, they kind of have to reveal that.
I feel if Pabst made a movie of your novel, he would probably focus a lot on the horrific caretaker family.
Yes.
In their home in Austria.
Yes.
You've really invented something spectacular there. It's like a horror film at home.
Mm-hmm.
Was that linked to anything that your parents may have experienced?
It was linked to some, in a way, not, I mean, atmospherically, it was linked to some of stories my father told me, like the neighbor, like in their garden. They were then expelled from the house. The house was arisiert, in which my father and his family lived. But before that happened, the neighbor, who was always very friendly, was whenever he could, was lifting his head over the fence and was not actually shouting, like more like gently humming, Jew, like you literally cannot invent that. So I'm not using that story, but this atmosphere of low-level people becoming utterly sadistic and mean suddenly. Because they can. They couldn't before, they had to hide those impulses, and now they suddenly can. And there's also, it's kind of my homecoming to an Austrian tradition of writing in a way. There is a real Austrian tradition of having those utterly mean caretaker people like Canetti in Otto da Fe, or like some of the terrible housekeepers in Heimito von Dodera. So I felt like there's a real tradition of terribleness.
But you had to give him a Czech name.
Because he would have had a Czech name. Because all the real fascists in Austria at that point were from Czech families. That is just realism. And of course they wouldn't have pronounced it Czech because they were kind of embarrassed, and in many ways they heavily Germanized it, but he would have had a Czech name. And yes, I turned him into a kind of a mythical figure. So towards the end, they see him they recognize him in a cave painting, like some kind of eternal evil. So he's this kind of petit bourgeois evil person who just waits for the moment he can grab power. I feel like that's the eternal core of fascism. That's the truth of fascism at all times. And
exactly that is what the wife says at the end of the war already. She says those were the people who have been in charge of the whole thing.
Yes, and I agree with that. She says that and because I agree with that. Yes.
Well, you happen to agree with your character.
Yes, I do.
you wrote her speech.
Yes, sometimes I do agree with my characters.
And can you reveal what you're working on now? I was interested because you live between Berlin and New York. Yes. What is your writing life like, and what are you working on?
My writing life is when I'm not traveling like now, I sit down every day, not always at the same time, not always under the same circumstances, but I try to write a little bit every day. The only thing I am going to reveal is, because you said in the beginning, and many people say that to me now, you usually write about historical characters, and I'm always saying I did it a few times, but I also wrote other books. Mm-hmm. I do recognize the fact that my most successful books and the books people react to most strongly are about historical characters, or characters from, Till Unspiegel is not a historical character, but a character from the mythic past in some way, in his case.
Yeah.
But I am not yet ready to concede that that's what I'm best at. So I'm still writing other things and having a lot of actually fun with that. So right now I'm writing the only thing I'm going to say, because I am superstitious, I'm writing a comic novel that is very much set in the present and taking part right now.
That's a lot. Daniel Kehlmann, thank you so much for talking to Shop Talk with Writers.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Shop Talk with Writers. The Director, by Daniel Kehlmann, is published by River Run, an imprint of Quercus. If you're a fan of this author or any other writers we feature on this podcast, please let us know your thoughts about their books and about this conversation. We'd love to hear from you in comments on Spotify, Instagram, Apple, or on my Substack. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and will share it with friends. Tune in again soon for exciting new episodes with writers Armand Dangour and Charlotte Mendelssohn. Thank you.